In certain circumstances, it may be necessary, instead of manipulating the joints for control or pain, it may be necessary to break the joints to disable your opponent completely, including killing. I'll proceed to show you some of the various methods of these joint breaks. For instance, let's take a simple shoulder grab. Jim grabs me here by the shoulder. What I'll do is I'll hold his hand to my body, raise his arm up and over to this position. Now, downward pressure on his elbow joint will cause it to break with very little effort. A very hard slap will break the joint quite easily. Also, turning over his arm into this position, I can easily snap his wrist instead of causing him pain, completely breaking both of these joints. I can begin with a snap here if I feel like it. A quick push will snap the joint in that direction. Let's say he was to punch me. As Jim throws a punch, I would step back, close these two hands in a snapping fashion, locking and breaking his elbow from a punch. Would you repeat that, Jim?
Yes, sir.
In a simple manner, you can dislocate or easily break his arm from a punch. The shoulder joint is also quite easy to break. When you take your opponent down in a pin, in this fashion, you simply have to step across his body and lean on his extended arm and tear it right at the shoulder joint. For killing, for a quick kill, Aikidoists would break the neck. This will instantly kill a person. From a front punch, as Jim launches a punch, I would block it, step around behind it, lead him down, and at this point, snap his neck. Let me review that one more time. This is a very dangerous technique. As he punches, I would evade it, lead him down and around, and at this point, with both hands, a very quick twist would break his neck. Some of the traditional ways of knife defenses are not always realistic. However, these knife defenses that I'm going to show you with my partner, Jim, are very realistic and useful. Jim? For instance, a knife attacker may not always show the knife. Sometimes they have the knife concealed. So you must be always prepared in any kind of confrontation to be aware. Now, Jim is moving in close. He's going to make a sudden stab at my abdomen. What I'm going to do is turn my body, slowly, Jim, please. Turn my body to the side here to block his knife strike. At this point, I would then grab his wrist with the knife in it, extend his arm out. With my other arm underneath his elbow, I will raise it and lower his hand until the knife drops out of his hand from the pain. I will explain this technique again. Slowly we will do it. As Jim strikes at me with the knife, I will turn my body to the side, deflecting the knife with my arm. At this point, I will grab him firmly to secure the knife. I will then slide my arm up as I pull him forward, continuing to keep him off balance. At this point, as I raise up and press down, there's a tremendous amount of pain involved here, and he cannot hold on to the knife. And I have him controlled at this point. Now watch this at full speed. I will demonstrate the next knife disarming technique at slow speed. My partner will thrust forward with the knife, overhead attack. I will block it in this fashion. Then I will force his arm downward and pass it into this hand. At this point, while he's still holding the knife, I'll step through. Let him continue to hold the knife into this position. Now at this position, I could take the knife away from him, but instead, I'm going to throw him forward. As I throw him forward, he loses hold of the knife. I'll now pull him quickly to the forehead and pin him in a painful wrist lock, putting all my weight on his fingers in the back of his hand, keeping his elbow locked and keeping him securely forced to the ground. Now watch this at full speed. This is a very dangerous position to be trapped in with a knife attacker. As the knife is held near your throat, and even if it is up against your throat, you may stand a chance of being cut, but not as thoroughly as a knife attacker could cut you in this position. What you must do is remain calm. Quickly push the knife across and away from your throat with a hard push to his elbow. At this point, secure his knife hand and arm against your body. You will then drop to your right knee and throw him. In this position, you will push his arm, which you're holding here at the elbow, forward. Then simply move forward on your left knee into this position. Remove the knife from his hand. His arm is locked, elbow locked at the joint by downward pressure on his hand. I can secure the lock further by moving it to this fashion. He now has him locked between my knees and up against my body, cradled in my arms. I need only to turn my hips to cause him intense pressure and pain. This will now be done at full speed. This next knife technique will be done against the small of my back. As my opponent puts the knife into the small of my back, I begin to turn my body. As I turn my body, I force the knife back into this position. I continue to turn, reaching up around behind my opponent, securing his neck, pulling my arm back, locking his elbow, forcing him to drop the knife. I quickly step back with my right foot and then my left and hold him in a painful choking. And choke him unconscious. Watch this at full speed, and remember, the spinning is a very important factor in this technique. Continuing in the knife technique defenses, the average street thug will menace you first with a knife before they attempt to cut you with it, to scare you. Jim will threaten me with the knife, and I'll return the knife directly back into his stomach. Watch this technique again, please. The block is very important. I block him in this fashion, force his arm downward, controlling the hand with the knife. At this point, he will remain immobilized only for the tiniest part of a second. I continue to lead him down and off balance so he cannot counter my attack. Raising his arm up, I step underneath it and quickly bring it down into his abdomen, stabbing him with his own knife. Watch this again at street speed. This knife technique I will demonstrate slowly. As your opponent steps forward to stab you, you will quickly step off to the side, passing his knife welding arm downward until it had run out of steam. You will then place your other hand behind his neck, continuing to push the arm upward. At this point, you will rotate your hand into the crook of his elbow and hold him in this fashion. Continue to press downward on his neck, step back, turn your hips, and throw him. I'll now perform this technique at full speed. This next knife defense will be from a straight thrust. As the knife is thrust towards you, you will step to the side and parry the knife into this position. At this position, you will then lead your opponent down and around to this position. You will direct him downward, holding on both hands his knife hand, and throw him. Then we will pull him into you and lock him in a painful lock, his elbow being locked again, and painful pressure being put on the back of his hand, locking his wrist. I'd like to bring out some further points to this technique. As my opponent makes his thrust and I parry, I'm actually parrying with this part of my arm rather than just grabbing. This is very important. I can then place my hand on his wrist at the juncture of his wrist and hand that's holding the knife. I'll now step back and lead him around me to this position. At this position, I will then step back and place my other hand on his again. Now I'm holding him in this position very securely. His hand is close to his shoulder. I'm going to thrust him downward and with a twist of my wrist, revolve him. I now will pull him into me, securing him between my knees with a locked elbow, easily able to take the knife away from him, and pressing down firmly on the back of his hand, causing him great pain. I'll now perform this technique at full speed. This next knife technique will be done with a straight thrust. As your opponent steps forward with thrust with the knife, you would pull him forward to this position. As you pull him forward to this position, his momentum continues to come. You'll bring your right arm up and across to his neck here. Do not, and under any circumstances, hit your opponent directly in the throat. If you practice this technique, it can be very, very deadly. Instead, you want to hit them across the top of the chest and over the neck area here, just as I'm describing. Now, when you get to this position and lead him in and step in with your full body weight, his legs will immediately go out from underneath him and it will have a shattering fall. Watch from a different angle as I again explain this technique. As your opponent steps forward, you parry to the side, lead him downward. At this point, you come up and across, still holding on to your opponent, hit him in this position, upward and then downward, stepping through, taking him completely off balance. What I'd like to do now is do some freestyle defenses against the knife. As a practitioner, you must work very, very often on these techniques in order to polish them, to do them well. What I'm going to be doing with my partner here is years and years of training have literally built into me reflexes that make the performance of a technique look quite simple. But actually, they're very complicated techniques and require a great deal of practice. However, I'd like to entertain you for a while with just a little freestyle knife defense. Thank you. Defending against a weapon is always a very dangerous thing to do. However, there are methods which you can disarm someone with a gun, and I am going to proceed to show you some of these methods, but remember, it is a very dangerous thing to try to take a gun away from someone. I would only use these methods as a last resort. Jim? Jim will place the gun to the side of my head. At this point, it requires very little effort for the gunman to shoot me. However, by a slight turn of my head, reaching up and pulling forward, turning, I've just locked his elbow. Now, for me to take this gun away requires only a little pressure downward, and I can take the gun out of his hand. Now, watch again, and we'll review the same technique. Jim? I will turn my head quickly, same direction the gun is facing. Reach up, grasp my opponent's wrist, and pull him forward into this position. His elbow is now locked. I need only to put downward pressure in order to get him to release the gun. Now, if we perform this technique at speed, I want you to listen for the pulling of the trigger to see if I have moved quickly enough to evade being shot. Jim? This next disarming technique will be done from a front position. From this position, it requires very little effort for him to shoot me. However, I will step quickly to the side, turning my head, evading the barrel of the gun, pulling forward into the same position, and taking the gun away from my opponent. This disarming technique from a frontal position, Jim, there are several factors that you have to be aware of. While it is very dangerous to take a gun away from somebody, it can be done. First thing, you must always remain relaxed. Although this is a very difficult position to be in, and to remain relaxed, it is of the utmost importance that you are. By turning your head as you step, you can evade the barrel of the gun, continue turning, pull his arm forward. At this point, his elbow is locked. Downward pressure causes intense pain, and he cannot do anything while you take the gun away from him. Now watch this at full speed and listen for the trigger pull. This gun disarming technique will be done from the rear position. As your opponent puts the gun to the back of your head, you will turn. When you're turning, do not hurry your turn. This will quickly set off a reaction in your opponent and perhaps fire. As you turn, the slow movement will distract him, temporarily putting his mind in with no thought. Quickly move around. Lock his arm. Here, his elbow is now locked. There is pain involved here, and he will drop the gun as I choke him. Now I can take him down and choke him unconscious. Watch this technique again. In this position, I have locked his arm securely. There is pain already in his elbow. I am lifting his chin up into a choking position, and now I'm forcing him to drop the gun from the pain in his elbow. I drop quickly backward, apply 2 hands to choke, and choke him unconscious. Watch this at street speed. This disarming technique will be done with the gun at the small of my back. As my opponent puts the gun to my back, I will quickly turn my body into him, disarm, pushing the gun out of my line of fire. I will continue to pivot on this foot around behind him to this point. At this point, I will cut in on his arm and quickly reverse my direction, taking him down. At this point, I will press down with my knee on the inside of his elbow, Take the gun away from him and keep him subjugated. Watch again, please, and I'll explain this gun disarming technique. As your opponent puts the gun in the small of your back, you'll quickly turn to your side, stepping and pushing the gun away and out of your line of fire with your right arm. At this position, you continue to step around behind him and then crook your hand up into crook of his elbow. Turn, throw him down. At this position, although he still has the gun, you now have the opportunity to grasp his hand, step across and kneel on the crook of his elbow, and you're able to take the gun out of his hand while you keep him pinned. This wrist lock, I'm putting a great deal of pressure on the back of his hand near his fingers. His elbow is locked, and I'm painfully leaning on his neck. Causes him intense pain. We'll now do this at street speed. This disarming technique will be done from a frontal position. As your opponent places a gun and points it at you, if you are within arm's reach of the gun, you have a chance in which to disarm him before he can pull the trigger. You must first be very relaxed. Now I want you to listen. I'm going to take the gun away from him. I want you to listen for the pull of the trigger. I'll explain this technique step by step. As the opponent points the weapon at you, there may be only a split second for you to disarm him before he fires. I want you to listen. At this point, I'm going to ask my partner to pull the trigger. I've taken the gun away from him before he was able to pull the trigger. And the reason for that was my complete relaxation. Had I triggered any movement, that he would have reacted to it and shot me. But by doing this relaxed, I did not telegraph my intentions, and I was able to take the gun away before he could fire it. He is now in a painful hold. Let me explain this technique step by step. As the gun's pointed towards me, I will quickly step out with my left foot and use my left hand to press the gun away from me. At this point, I can now firmly secure his grip. And even if he fires now, I am out of the line of sight. Now, at this position, I press with my other hand firmly downward to unbalance him. Then twisting his wrist here and adding my other hand to his elbow, I begin to turn his body. At this point, I can now lock him into a painful choke by pressing on his neck and his wrist at the same time. I will now proceed to show you defenses against a larger weapon such as a baseball bat. As my partner Jim swings the bat at my head, I will step inside, blocking in this fashion. I will continue the movement, making sure that I'm not struck by the bat. Stepping back, I will put my hand on the back of his head, push down, lead this arm downward, and throw him. I will then pull him forward, lock him in a painful arm lock, discard the bat, and press down on his wrist, causing pain. I'd like to show you the same technique at street speed. Jim? Pain. Pain. This next defense from a bat attack will be an overhead strike towards my head. As he makes the strike, I will step in at this moment, grasp his sleeve or arm, continue to let his motion come forward so he rides up on that one leg and then pull downward and rotate into a fall. Now watch it from this angle. As he raises the bat and it proceeds to come downward, I step inside and pivot. At this point, I'm grasping his sleeve or his arm. I am now going to lead him forward and downward so that all his weight rests upon his one foot, and I can rotate him from this position. Now watch this at street speed. This next defense from a bat, he will swing a bat at me with two hands. As he does so, I will again step inside. Very important that I evade the bat. At this point, I have secure hold on both his arms. I continue to lead his motion forward, again, to rotate him. Now watch this again at street speed. He has tremendous power, so I must evade the bat at all costs. This next technique, my partner will try to take my head off with the bat, and I will show you a very superior defense against it. As he steps in to strike me with the bat, I will make a blocking action with my hand, quickly step around behind him, leading him down into this position. Then turning my body in the opposite direction, I will throw him down quickly. Now we'll do this at street speed. This next defense will be from an overhead strike with the bat. I block his overhead strike, grasping his arm with both hands. This is not a direct confrontation block. What I'm actually doing is parrying the block, not taking its full force. I will then hold securely with this hand in this position, step forward, quickly drop underneath while I keep him off balance. Drop underneath, cut his legs out from under him, throw him, grasp his wrist, two hands, pull him over and lock him into a very painful, secure lock. We will now proceed to do this technique at street speed. Assaults can happen practically anywhere. You can be seated at a restaurant and have somebody assault you. Aikido is very useful martial art for discouraging people from assault without having to go further sometimes than just a discouragement. So my partner Jimmy here will assault me in some of the more common ways, and I'll show you methods of dealing with these assaults. Somebody approaches you, for instance, pointing a finger in your face. You need only to reach up, grasp his finger, as I shown earlier, and you can use it to take him down and away, again with the same finger point. This particular technique is really quite simple. My thumb and the back of his finger. My middle finger underneath his. Pressure upward and downward causes intense pain in the joint and is very easy. Toss him away. Thank you, Jim.
Yes, yes.
Grasp his finger, as I shown earlier, and you can use it to take him down and away. Again, even though you are seated, Aikido is very useful. You develop good leverage no matter what position you're in. My partner, Jimmy, will come over here and attack me at random. We'll review this technique much slower for you. As Jimmy grabs me and launches a punch, I will block his punch and continue it in the same direction, exposing his back to me so that I can grab his hair. At this point, I pull backward and downward. Jimmy will fall. And as he falls, I continue to hold on to his wrist. At this point, I bend his wrist sharply downward, causing pain, locking it between my two hands. Very effective. We will review this at full speed. If an assault, a kicking technique is used in the assault, one of the most common is the roundhouse kick. My partner, Jim, will assault me with such a technique. We will review this kicking technique slowly so you'll be able to understand it more thoroughly. As Jimmy kicks, I block and trap. Block with this hand and trap with this hand. Then with this hand, I cut downward, forcing Jimmy off balance and to the floor. Then I move in, keeping this foot securely locked against my arm, and lean forward, causing him pain and pinning him. Even though you're seated and an opponent comes up to you and violently yanks you out of the chair you're sitting in, there are still many methods in which to deal with that kind of attack. One of these methods would be to throw your opponent end over end. Jim? As Jimmy grasps me and begins to pull me out of the chair, I'll completely relax and let him pull me. When I reach a point where I can regain my balance, I will push up on his elbow, press down on the back of his neck, and push forward, throwing him end over end. We will review this again at full speed, but the factors of relaxation are very important. When your opponent grasps you, you want to be totally relaxed until the time you reach your feet, and then you can incorporate all the necessary elements into the throw.
Come on, I had it with you.
While seated, you can sometimes be attacked completely unexpectedly from the rear with a choke. My assistant Jim will perform a chokehold. We'll now perform again the same technique slowly so that you'll be able to thoroughly understand it. Jim? As he encircles my head with his arm, I'm going to reach up, grab the back of his hair, in this position, lowering my chin so that his chokehold cannot be accomplished. I can still breathe and still maintain my strength. I'll then reach up, placing this hand and these fingers under his nose, forcing him downward by pulling him and forcing on his nose. This is a very painful position for him, and the more pressure I put on his nose, the more painful it is. One of the most important factors is not to allow your opponent to pressure your throat and cut off your supply of oxygen. This will weaken you quickly. In order to prevent that, you need only to lower your chin into the crook of his elbow. This will give you plenty of breathing space and enable you to perform a technique. Jim, please. Now you have a situation where someone's seated close to you. It can be on a subway, a park bench, a card game, and you're attacked by the person sitting next to you with a punch. As soon as you take your opponent down, place the back of your hand on his head and push upward under the chin and angle it slightly downward as you do so. This puts a great deal of pressure on the back of his neck, and you can also cut off his breathing very simply by pressing on his windpipe. Although pressing on the windpipe is dangerous because a forceful press can cause swelling on the inside of the windpipe and cut off his air, so that is dangerous. But under any circumstances, if your life is threatened, whatever is necessary is necessary. Let's look at it again slowly. Jim launches a punch. This block is very important. Even though his motion is continuing to come forward, I'm still evading his power, reaching around, grabbing him by the back of the head and pulling his hair downward. I then will reach over as he's going down, turning his chin upward. I then kneel on his body to prevent his movement and continue to force his chin upward and slightly downward to cause pain. I can then, if it's necessary, apply pressure to his windpipe. This particular technique really takes quite a long time and quite a bit of training to accomplish well. But it'll give you some understanding of the potential that each person would have using the art of Aikido. My partner Jim will first push me, and as I raise my hand to ward off his next push, he'll grab me by both hands. This technique, while it is an advanced technique, it can give you an understanding of the potential of Aikido. We'll review this technique slowly. As he pushes me, I place my hand to protect myself from another push. Jim grasps me by both of his hands. I merely lead him upward while he's still holding me and cut down sharply, rotating him over into a throw. I'll next grab his wrist and hand while he's still holding me and pull him to me, locking him in a very painful arm lock. His elbow is locked completely by this twisting of his wrist. And downward pressure causes him intense pain. Thank you for watching my videotape on Aikido self-defense. I hope it has given you great insight on how to escape from most self-defense situations unharmed. Please practice the techniques carefully and diligently and they will serve you well. Thank you.